Hi, my name is Chelsea from 25th and Mag, and today we're on part 2 of my Learn to Quilt series where I walk you through how to sew my free gridline quilt pattern from start to finish. Today we are going to learn how to trim, baste, and quilt our quilt, so let's get started. So in the last video I showed you how to prepare our backing, and to baste you will want to lay that on a flat surface, wrong side up. So make sure that the nice side is flat down. Typically this is something I would do on a floor or a large table, but I am showing you on a smaller scale today so you get a better visual of how to do this. So now I use painter's tape to hold down the backing while I baste together. So I will start with painter's tape on each of the corners of the backing and slightly pull it taut. You want to make sure this lays completely smooth with no wrinkles. And once you get the corners down, you can add painter's tape into those points in between, but really you just want to make sure that your backing will hold still as you baste it and that everything is smooth. So now you'll get your batting and lay it center on the backing. And depending on the batting size, you may need to trim this down, but you want to make sure that it is still larger than your quilt top. So batting sometimes has a right side and a wrong side. I'm using warm and natural, and this does have a right side and a wrong side. So the side facing up towards the quilt top is the one with the flex and bits in it, but check your manufacturer, they may have different suggestions for theirs. So now you want to get your batting and make sure it is completely smooth over the backing fabric. So there are a couple ways to baste your quilt. Some people prefer using basting spray. I like Otif 505. And other people prefer just using safety pins. So if you decide to use basting spray, first you will want to fold back half of your batting. And you will always spray on the batting, never spray on your fabric. Sometimes it'll dry and leave weird spots. So give it a light spray on half of the batting and let it dry for a few seconds. It will feel kind of tacky but not wet. Then slowly fold that over onto your backing and smooth it out with your hands. And now fold back the other half of your batting. Spray your basting spray directly on the batting. Give it a few seconds to dry and then fold that back over and smooth it out. And now we are going to add our quilt top to our quilt sandwich. And now our quilt top will be right side up. And just to note, if you are basting with safety pins, you do not have to do anything yet, but I do recommend using more painter's tape to tape down the batting and your quilt top to make sure that is staying flat while you do the next steps. And now if you're basting with spray, you will fold back half of your quilt top and spray directly on the batting. Just a reminder, we do not spray on the fabric, just the batting. So spray on your batting and again let it dry for a few seconds and then fold back the quilt top and use your hands to smooth it out. Make sure there's no wrinkles, bubbles, make sure it lays flat. And now we fold back the other half and repeat those same steps to baste our quilt. So another option for basting your quilt is using curved safety pins. Some people have a preference for doing one or the other or maybe even both. But for safety pins, you will smooth out your quilt, maybe use more painter's tape to hold it still, and then pin through all 3 layers. I recommend spacing these about 5 inches apart from one another in alternating positions so your quilt is pinned throughout its entirety. Personally, I don't find that either one of these is better than another. There's pros and cons to each. But once you have your quilt basted, you can remove the painter's tape and you are ready to begin quilting your quilt. And before you start quilting, there's a couple things we need to do. First is our stitch length. My machine comes standard at a 2.5, but I recommend 3 to 3.5. And you'll also want your thread color to be whatever thread color you want to show on your quilting. You'll also need a walking foot on your machine. I highly recommend this. It is going to be so much easier to quilt and you'll find that your stitches come out much smoother. And now it's time for the fun part. We can begin quilting our quilt. So make sure you start somewhere in the center of your quilt. If you're doing straight lines, I like to find a straight line on the quilt and follow with my foot to give me a first straight line. And when you begin stitching, start stitching on your batting. And now we're going to slowly make our way through quilting. You want to make sure your quilt is supported, especially if you're using a larger quilt. You want to make sure the weight of the quilt isn't hanging off the table. You don't want your machine to be doing that work of pulling it through, so use your hands to make sure it is going through smoothly. And when you are done, you can cut your thread over the batting. And if you're using a walking foot, they come with these guide bars, and you can use that to follow a previous stitch of your quilting to get them evenly spaced. And this only applies if you're doing straight lines. Some people like to do free motion. There are all kinds of ways to quilt a quilt, but if you're doing your first quilt, sometimes doing straight lines is the easiest way. So use that ruler guide to create that distance and follow your last quilting stitch all the way down your quilt. You will just repeat this, working towards the end of your quilt and then going back to the center and working out towards the other end. Now, after quilting your quilt, you are going to want to trim your quilt. So I'm back to this Gridline quilt, and I will show you on a much larger scale. And this you will definitely want as long of a ruler as possible. So when trimming, I like to start on the corner of a quilt, and I use my ruler to line up on something on the quilt to make sure I'm doing a straight cut. So on this Gridline quilt, for instance, I found that lining it up at 4 inches will give me a nice trim. You just want to trim this close to the edge as possible. So now we get our rotary cutter and start trimming our quilt. I like to start on a corner just to make sure that it is perfectly squared at a 90-degree angle. And you want to make sure you're using your other hand holding the ruler down as firmly as possible. You don't want the ruler to slip and mess up cutting at this stage. Now we will just advance our quilt along and continue trimming. So this quilt in particular is easy to trim because I know I can line up that ruler at 4 inches. Sometimes you don't have something to line up your ruler with, so you want to make sure you're aligning it on the left side that you've already trimmed and along with the edge of the quilt to make sure that you're keeping the ruler straight as you cut. So now we are approaching that other corner of the quilt, and this is again where you want to make sure the ruler is lined up with your existing cut and that it is going to cut that corner at a 90-degree angle. So I like to use my rotary cutter to cut along the top and right sides, and I find that that really keeps my corners at 90 degrees and keeps everything square. So now we have our quilt done and ready for binding. Be sure to check out the third video in my Learn to Quilt series where I show you how to make binding and attach it to your quilt.